How can someone earn more money than ever before and still feel poorer? It sounds like a contradiction. Your salary rises. Your paycheck is larger on paper. Your income is moving in the right direction. But when you pay the rent, buy groceries, fill the car, or review your monthly bills, the extra money seems to disappear before it improves anything. This is not just a feeling. Imagine that your salary increases by 5%. Under normal circumstances, that sounds like progress. But if the cost of maintaining the same lifestyle rises by 7%, you are not 5% richer. You can now afford less than you could before. The number on your paycheck has gone up. The value of that paycheck has gone down. This distinction matters because most people measure financial progress in nominal terms. They compare this year's salary with last year's salary. If the number is higher, they assume their standard of living must also be higher. But a salary is not valuable because of the number printed on it. It is valuable because of what it can buy. A monthly income of $4,000 in 1 year may provide a better life than an income of $4,500 several years later. The second number is larger, but the cost of housing, food, transportation, energy, insurance, and basic services may have risen even faster. That is where inflation changes the meaning of income. Inflation does not usually reduce the amount of money you receive. It reduces the amount of value that money represents. The International Monetary Fund describes the erosion of purchasing power and real income as one of the central costs of inflation. When prices rise faster than wages, households lose economic ground even while their earnings continue to increase. This is why official wage growth can look encouraging while personal finances still feel strained. A worker may receive a raise, yet cut back on restaurants. A family may earn more, yet postpone buying a home. A business may increase employee salaries, yet see those employees remain dissatisfied because essential costs have absorbed the entire adjustment. The common assumption is simple: higher wages should produce a better life. But that assumption only works when wages rise faster than the cost of living. If prices increase first, and salaries respond later, the raise may not create new purchasing power. It may only help recover part of what has already been lost. So the real question is not whether salaries are rising. The real question is whether those salaries can still buy more. To understand why so many people feel poorer in a world of higher wages, we have to separate three things that are often treated as if they were the same: the amount of money people earn, the prices they face, and the standard of living that remains after those prices are paid. To see why this happens, we first have to separate three concepts that are often treated as if they were interchangeable: nominal income, real income, and purchasing power. Nominal income is simply the amount of money that appears on your paycheck. It is the figure your employer transfers to your bank account before considering how much the prices around you have changed. Real income is different. It measures what that paycheck can actually buy after inflation has been taken into account. Purchasing power is the practical result. It answers a simple question: after paying today's prices, how much of your life can your income still afford? These differences may sound technical, but they shape almost every financial decision households make. Consider two workers who earn exactly the same salary. One lives in a city where housing costs remain relatively stable. The other lives in a market where rent has increased by 20% over just a few years. Although both workers receive identical paychecks, their financial reality is completely different because a much larger share of one's salary is consumed by essential expenses before any discretionary spending even begins. This is why economists do not evaluate living standards by looking at wages alone. They compare wages with prices. The same principle applies across entire economies. Central banks and statistical agencies track inflation using broad measures of consumer prices. In the United States, one of the most familiar is the Consumer Price Index. The Federal Reserve also closely follows the Personal Consumption Expenditures Price Index because it reflects changes in consumer spending patterns more dynamically as households substitute between products when relative prices change. Neither measure exists to tell people how much money they earn. Their purpose is to estimate how much the purchasing power of money changes over time. However, no single inflation rate perfectly describes every household. A retired couple spends differently from a young family with children. Someone who rents an apartment faces different pressures from someone who paid off a mortgage years ago. A commuter who drives every day experiences fuel price increases differently from someone who relies on public transportation. Each household effectively carries its own basket of expenses. That is why two families living in the same country can experience inflation very differently. There is another reason the gap between wages and purchasing power becomes so noticeable. Prices can adjust remarkably quickly. A manufacturer facing higher raw material costs may revise prices within weeks. A restaurant coping with rising food and labor expenses can update its menu almost immediately. Retailers regularly change prices as transportation, energy, or supplier costs fluctuate. Wages rarely move with that same speed. Most employees negotiate salaries annually. Many companies review compensation only once each fiscal year. Government budgets, corporate planning cycles, employment contracts, and collective bargaining agreements all create delays before higher labor costs are reflected in workers' pay. Businesses also face difficult trade-offs. When operating costs increase, managers cannot always respond by immediately raising salaries. They must balance payroll with profitability, investment, hiring plans, and competitive pricing. In many industries, increasing wages too quickly without corresponding productivity gains can threaten financial performance. As a result, prices often begin moving long before incomes fully adjust. This timing difference is critical because households continue paying today's prices every single day while waiting for tomorrow's salary review. Understanding that delay explains why periods of rising inflation often feel far more painful than the headline wage numbers suggest. But this relationship became especially visible during one of the most unusual economic periods in recent history, when prices accelerated across much of the world while wage adjustments struggled to keep pace. That delay became impossible to ignore after the coronavirus pandemic. The global economy reopened faster than supply chains could recover. Consumers returned to restaurants, travel, and retail. Governments had provided extraordinary fiscal support during the crisis. Businesses suddenly faced strong demand while still struggling with shortages of raw materials, shipping capacity, labor, and energy. The result was a rapid increase in prices across much of the world. For many households, the first signs appeared in everyday purchases. Grocery bills climbed. Utility costs increased. Fuel prices surged. Housing became significantly more expensive in many markets. The monthly budget changed long before most employment contracts did. Companies were facing their own version of the same problem. Manufacturers paid more for inputs. Retailers paid more for transportation. Restaurants paid more for ingredients and labor. Airlines dealt with higher fuel costs. Every business had to decide how much of these higher costs could be absorbed internally and how much had to be passed on to customers through higher prices. Many chose some combination of both. Meanwhile, employees naturally expected higher wages as living costs increased. But wage adjustments followed a much slower rhythm. Most employers could not simply raise salaries every time inflation accelerated. Compensation decisions required budget approvals, financial planning, productivity expectations, and competitive considerations. In many industries, raising wages too aggressively without corresponding improvements in output would simply create another round of cost pressure. This mismatch between rapidly changing prices and gradually changing wages produced one of the defining economic experiences of the early 21st century. Official wage data showed workers receiving larger paychecks, yet many households felt financially worse off. The numbers explain why. According to the United States Bureau of Labor Statistics, real average hourly earnings declined by 1.7% between December 2021 and December 2022. Real average weekly earnings fell even further because average hours worked also changed during that period. In other words, workers were earning more dollars, but those dollars were buying less. The direction began to improve during the following year. The Bureau of Labor Statistics reported that real average hourly earnings increased by 0.8% between December 2022 and December 2023 as wage growth gradually moved ahead of inflation. That sounded like welcome news, but it did not erase what had already happened. Imagine climbing down 3 steps before climbing up 1. Your direction has changed. Your position has not fully recovered. The same pattern appeared across many advanced economies. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development found that real wages had started recovering in numerous member countries by early 2025. However, in roughly two-thirds of those countries, real wages still remained below their levels at the beginning of 2021. This distinction is crucial because inflation is cumulative. If prices increase sharply over several years, they usually do not return to their previous levels simply because inflation slows. Lower inflation means prices are rising more slowly. It does not mean prices are falling back to where they were. That is why many households continued to feel pressure, even after headlines announced that inflation was easing and wage growth was improving. Their incomes were finally beginning to catch up. But catching up is not the same as getting ahead. The apparent contradiction between higher salaries and weaker purchasing power was no longer a matter of perception. It had become a measurable economic reality. And that reality points toward a much deeper explanation of what many people mistakenly believe a salary increase actually represents. The most common explanation is that inflation makes life more expensive. That is true, but it is not the entire story. The deeper reality is that many salary increases are not creating new wealth at all. They are often repairing purchasing power that has already been lost. This changes how we should interpret wage growth. Imagine that prices across your essential expenses rise by 10% over 2 years. During those same 2 years, your employer eventually raises your salary by 10%. Looking only at your paycheck, it appears that you have received a meaningful increase. Looking at your purchasing power, almost nothing has changed. Your higher salary is not taking you somewhere new. It is trying to bring you back to where you started. That distinction explains why so many workers feel disappointed after receiving raises they once would have celebrated. The raise itself is real. The improvement in living standards may not be. This also explains why timing matters so much. Prices appear everywhere in daily life. Every visit to the supermarket, every rent payment, every utility bill reminds households that costs have changed. Salary adjustments, however, usually happen only once or twice a year. People experience higher prices continuously while experiencing higher wages only occasionally. The psychological effect is powerful because losses are immediate while compensation arrives later. There is another important layer. Inflation does not affect every household equally. A family spending a large share of its income on housing, food, and transportation experiences inflation differently from a household whose expenses are concentrated elsewhere. Someone who owns appreciating financial assets or real estate may partially offset higher consumer prices through rising asset values. Someone whose primary source of wealth is a monthly paycheck has far fewer ways to protect purchasing power. Inflation therefore changes more than average living standards. It changes how purchasing power is distributed across society. Businesses experience similar pressures. When operating costs increase, companies often raise wages to retain employees and remain competitive in the labor market. At first glance, this appears generous. In reality, management may simply be trying to prevent workers from falling further behind rising living costs. The company is reacting to an environment that has already changed. Employees receive larger paychecks, but the business also faces higher payroll expenses, while customers continue facing higher prices. Everyone is adjusting to the same economic force from different directions. The Federal Reserve Survey of Household Economics and Decision-Making illustrates this gap between financial statistics and personal experience. Even as wage growth recovered, many Americans continued reporting that their financial condition was worse than before the pandemic, with inflation and higher prices remaining among their most significant concerns. That disconnect is not evidence that people misunderstand their finances. It reflects the difference between nominal progress and cumulative purchasing power. When inflation slows, the damage from earlier price increases does not automatically disappear. The higher price level remains. Households continue budgeting around that new reality. Viewed this way, many wage increases take on a different meaning. Instead of representing additional prosperity, they often represent delayed compensation for value that inflation has already removed. The paycheck becomes larger because the currency now purchases less. Understanding that distinction reshapes how we interpret both household finances and business decisions. It also explains why looking only at salary growth can produce a picture of economic progress that feels completely different from everyday life. Once we view income through purchasing power instead of the number printed on a paycheck, the apparent contradiction disappears. A salary is not an economic outcome by itself. It is only one side of an equation. The other side is the cost of maintaining a standard of living. That is why economists distinguish between nominal income and real income. A larger paycheck can coexist with weaker purchasing power if prices have risen by an even greater amount. In that situation, income has increased in monetary terms, but not necessarily in economic value. This changes how we should evaluate financial progress. Instead of asking whether wages are higher than they were last year, a more meaningful question is whether households can save more after paying for housing, food, transportation, healthcare, education, and other essential expenses. If the answer is no, then nominal growth alone tells an incomplete story. The same principle applies to businesses. A company may report higher revenue than ever before. Yet if higher sales merely reflect higher prices while operating costs have increased by a similar amount, profitability may improve very little. Looking only at revenue without considering inflation can create the same illusion as looking only at wages. That is why investors, economists, and business leaders spend so much time distinguishing between nominal and real performance. They understand that growth measured only in currency does not always represent growth in economic value. The same logic applies to personal finance. A household should not judge its financial health solely by annual salary reviews. It should also ask whether its purchasing power has improved, whether its savings can buy more than before, and whether its future financial flexibility is increasing or shrinking. Those questions provide a much clearer picture than income alone. This perspective also explains why economic statistics and public sentiment sometimes appear to move in opposite directions. Government data may show rising employment, increasing wages, and slowing inflation. At the same time, many families continue reporting financial stress. These observations are not necessarily contradictory. People experience the economy through the prices they pay every day, not through wage statistics published every month. If years of accumulated price increases have permanently raised the cost of everyday life, a recent improvement in real wage growth may feel less like moving forward and more like recovering lost ground. That is why inflation leaves such a lasting impression. It does not simply change prices. It changes the relationship between money and value. Once prices establish a higher level, every future financial decision is built upon that new foundation. Salary negotiations, business pricing, investment decisions, household budgets, and consumer behavior all adapt to a world where each unit of currency represents a different amount of purchasing power than it once did. Perhaps the most important shift in perspective is this: income should never be evaluated in isolation. Its true meaning only becomes visible when it is measured against what that income can actually purchase. A bigger paycheck can signal genuine economic progress. It can also represent nothing more than delayed compensation for purchasing power that inflation has already eroded. The difference between those two situations is not found on a salary statement. It is found in the standard of living that salary is ultimately able to sustain. And that is why the most important number is often not how much more money we earn, but how much more life that money is still capable of buying.